Start with the tip of the tongue phenomenon, because it's the clearest window into this. Psychologists Roger Brown and David McNeill ran the foundational experiment on this back in 1966 at Harvard, reading people dictionary definitions of obscure words, like the word for a small boat with a raised bow, or the technique for measuring the position of stars, and watching what happened when the exact word wouldn't surface. What they documented was a specific mental state, not a blank. People reported knowing the word's length, its stress pattern, sometimes even words that rhymed with it, while the word itself stayed just out of reach. The mechanism is now understood as a kind of transmission failure between two separate storage systems in the brain, one that holds meaning and one that holds sound. You retrieve the meaning fine. The link to the actual phonological form, the sound shape of the word, is what breaks. It happens more as people age, which is why it's often mistaken for memory loss, but it isn't memory loss at all. The memory is intact. It's the retrieval cable that's loose. Now compare that to walking into a room and instantly forgetting why you went there, which feels completely different, but is caused by almost the opposite kind of glitch. Psychologist Gabriel Radvansky at the University of Notre Dame spent years studying this and gave it a name: the doorway effect. In a 2011 series of experiments, his team had participants complete simple tasks in a virtual environment, walking through doorways to different rooms, and found that memory for what they'd been doing dropped measurably the moment a doorway was crossed, even when the physical distance walked was identical to a control condition with no doorway. Walking the same distance within one room caused far less forgetting. Here's the mechanism, and it's oddly architectural. Your brain files short-term intentions using the room or context you formed them in as a kind of storage tag. Psychologists call this an event boundary. Crossing a doorway signals to your brain that one event has ended and a new one has begun, so it does something like closing a tab and archiving it, except sometimes it archives the intention along with the scenery. You're not broken. Your brain just took the doorway literally. Déjà vu works on an entirely different mechanism, and it's one of the strangest sensations memory can produce, because it's not forgetting at all, it's the false feeling of remembering something you've never actually experienced. Around 60 to 70% of people report having felt it at least once, according to survey data compiled by psychologist Alan Brown at Southern Methodist University, who reviewed decades of studies on the phenomenon in 2003. The leading explanation involves something called familiarity without recollection. Your brain has two separate systems for recognizing things. One that says, "This feels familiar," and one that actually retrieves the specific memory of when and where you encountered it. Normally those two systems fire together. Déjà vu happens when the familiarity signal fires on its own, misfiring in response to a scene that merely resembles something you've seen before, a similar layout of furniture, a similar angle of light, without the retrieval system finding the actual matching memory to explain why. Your brain, faced with unexplained familiarity, does what it always does. It fills the gap with the nearest story available, which is, "I've been here before." You haven't. Your pattern matching system just got a little too trigger happy. Then there's Jamais Vu, déjà vu's much stranger, much rarer cousin, where a completely familiar thing suddenly feels bizarre and unrecognizable. Neuropsychologist Chris Moulin at the University of Leeds actually triggered this in a lab in 2006 using a deceptively simple method. He had participants write the word door over and over 30 times in a row. By around the 20th repetition, roughly 2/3 of participants reported that the word started to look wrong, foreign, like it wasn't even a real word anymore, a condition linguists separately call semantic satiation. Here's where it gets interesting. This is the mirror image of déjà vu. Instead of false familiarity attaching to something new, the automatic sense of familiarity that should attach to something you know perfectly well simply switches off from overuse, and your brain, again, needs a story to explain the mismatch, so it generates a sense of eerie unfamiliarity instead. Same underlying system. Opposite failure direction. False memories go a level deeper, because instead of glitching on the feeling of familiarity, they build entire fabricated events that feel exactly as real as true ones. Nobody demonstrated this more thoroughly than psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, who built her career, starting with a landmark 1974 study with John Palmer, showing that the specific wording of a question could reshape what people claim to remember. Participants, who watched footage of a car collision and were asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other, estimated significantly higher speeds than participants asked the identical question using the word hit, and a week later, the smashed group were also more likely to falsely remember seeing broken glass at the scene, when there was none. Loftus later went further, with an experiment nicknamed Lost in the Mall, successfully implanting a completely fictional childhood memory of getting lost in a shopping mall into roughly a quarter of adult participants, using nothing but a few suggestive prompts from a trusted family member. The mechanism is what researchers call the misinformation effect. Every time you recall a memory, it becomes temporarily editable, like a document reopened for revision, and information you encounter during that reopened window, a leading question, a suggestive detail, another person's account, can get woven directly into the memory, as if it had been there all along. Your brain doesn't tag the edit as an edit. It just resaves the whole file as original. That reopening process has its own name, memory reconsolidation, and it's actually the mechanism underneath almost everything else on this list, so it's worth pulling it out on its own. Neuroscientist Karim Nader ran the study that put this on the map in 2000, working with fear-conditioned rats at New York University. Conventional theory held that once a memory was consolidated, it was fixed in the brain in a stable, unchangeable form, like ink dried on paper. Nader's team found that when a fear memory was reactivated, and then a protein synthesis blocking drug was administered during the brief reactivation window, the memory could be erased entirely, as if it had never been consolidated in the first place. That result only makes sense if remembering physically breaks the memory back down before rebuilding it. Every act of recall, in other words, is quietly demolition and reconstruction happening in the same instant, which explains why memories can drift, merge, or shift slightly every single time you revisit them, even without anyone deliberately planting false information. Source confusion is the specific failure mode where the content of a memory survives intact, but the label of where it came from gets lost or swapped. Psychologist Marsha Johnson at Yale, working through the 1980s and 90s, called this source monitoring, and demonstrated that people routinely mix up whether they actually experienced something, read about it, imagined it, or dreamed it, because the brain doesn't store a clean, permanent tag on each memory saying, "This one is real." It reconstructs the source after the fact, using contextual clues, and those clues can be wrong. This is also the mechanism behind cryptomnesia, unconscious plagiarism, where someone genuinely believes they've had an original idea or written an original melody, when they've actually retrieved something they encountered years earlier with the source information stripped away. Musician George Harrison lost a 1976 copyright lawsuit over his song, "My Sweet Lord," after a court found it was subconsciously copied from the Chiffon's earlier hit, "He's So Fine." Not deliberate theft, the court concluded, but a memory whose melody survived while its origin tag didn't. Childhood amnesia takes this even further back, to the fact that virtually no one can remember anything from before roughly age 3 or 4, no matter how significant the event. Psychiatrist Sigmund Freud actually coined the term over a century ago, though his explanation involving repression has been almost entirely replaced by developmental neuroscience. Researcher Patricia Bauer at Emory University has spent decades tracking this with longitudinal studies, and one of her key findings is that the hippocampus, the brain structure most responsible for stitching experiences into long-term, dated, retrievable memories is still under heavy construction throughout early childhood, alongside language development that gives memories a narrative structure to attach to. Children under 3 can absolutely form memories, and even show evidence of recalling specific events for months afterward. But those early memories decay unusually fast, in a pattern Bower's data shows accelerating sharply around age 7, right as the narrative and hippocampal system finally comes fully online. You're not missing your earliest years because nothing happened. You're missing them because the filing system that turns experience into a retrievable, dated memory hasn't finished being built yet. Now, the Mandela effect takes everything so far and makes it social. Named after the false, but widely shared belief that Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 1980s, when he was in fact released in 1990, and lived until 2013, the phenomenon describes large groups of unrelated people confidently sharing the exact same false memory. Millions of people misremember the children's book series as the Berenstain Bears, when it has always been spelled Berenstain. Millions recall a non-existent 1990s movie called Shazam, starring the comedian Sinbad as a genie. Here's the thing nobody tells you about why this happens at scale. It's the misinformation effect and source confusion, but socially amplified. A plausible-sounding wrong spelling, a vaguely similar real movie, an offhand comment from a friend, any of these concede a false detail, and because human memory reconstructs rather than replays, and because we're constantly cross-checking our memories against other people's accounts without realizing it, a single plausible error can spread and calcify across an entire population, each person feeling 100% certain, because subjectively, a false memory and a true one feel identical. Stress and sleep hit this whole system from the mechanical side, not the content side. They don't insert false memories, they choke off access to real ones. Neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky at Stanford has documented for decades how the stress hormone cortisol, at chronically elevated levels, actively impairs function in the hippocampus, the same structure driving childhood amnesia, essentially jamming the retrieval machinery under sustained pressure, which is why people routinely blank on information they know perfectly well during a high-stakes exam or a hostile job interview. Sleep deprivation works through a related but distinct channel. Researcher Matthew Walker at UC Berkeley has shown across numerous studies that deep, slow-wave sleep is when the hippocampus physically transfers the day's short-term memories into more durable long-term storage in the cortex, a process sometimes described as nightly file transfer. Cut that sleep stage short, and the files simply never fully move, leaving you with gaps the next day that feel exactly like forgetting, but are really closer to memories that were never fully saved in the first place. Brain fog, that hazy, can't quite grab a thought feeling reported after illness, poor sleep, or extended stress, appears to be the subjective experience of this same retrieval bottleneck under sustained load, not a separate glitch, but the everyday, low-grade version of the same system straining under the same kind of pressure. Flashbulb memories flip everything on its head one more time, because they're the memories that feel the most bulletproof, the ones people insist they remember in perfect, vivid detail exactly where they were, what they were wearing, who they were with, usually tied to a shocking public event. Psychologists Roger Brown and James Kulik coined the term in 1977, studying people's memories of hearing about the assassination of President Kennedy, and found the account strikingly vivid and confidently told. But here's where it gets interesting, and where flashbulb memories connect directly back to reconsolidation, follow-up research, most notably a study led by Ulrich Neisser and Nicole Harsch tracking people's memories of the Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986, found that when the same people were asked again 2.5 years later, their accounts had changed substantially from what they'd reported the very next day, sometimes completely, down to being in a different city with different people, while their confidence in the accuracy of the new, wrong version stayed just as high as their confidence in the original. The vividness of a flashbulb memory has almost nothing to do with its accuracy. It just feels unusually well lit, because the emotional intensity of the moment convinced your brain to treat it as important, without actually making the reconstruction process any more reliable.